some of her work tonight.
Yeah, she's not going to be here. She has family visit.
Unbelievable. Well, see, let me do some of her part of everything, which is she asked me to be sure to thank the sponsors, who are Dee Dee and Bob Rice. I have no idea who they're. Also sponsoring this are Barbara and Greg Masterson. Also, a thanks to the guest baker, who I think just disappeared behind the doors, Barbara Erickson. Oh, there you go. And Rob just mentioned that I guess a lot of these series are sponsored or have some relationship to Tickham's bookstore, and your name Ray Tickham is here. She was selling books, but I think that's kind of awesome. Hi, Ray. Most of you have no idea who I am and why the heck I'm the person standing here, but I'll tell you. My name is Avery Revere, and there's some relationship. The Paul Revere, this guy here, was my great-great-great-great-grandfather. And Ann asked me to walk down the street to stand here to introduce Rob. I also am, as is our family tradition, I am a member, actually I'm the president of the board of directors for the Paul Revere Memorial Association, which is the organization that runs the Paul Revere House up in Boston's North End. Rob is one of our board of directors members, so that's very cool. And anyway, of course you know he's here because he's written the book Midnight Ride, Industrial Dawn, Paul Revere and the Growth of American Enterprise. I guess I thought I wanted to say something personal, a little about Paul Revere. And I kind of came to, when I was walking down the street, that just a couple of weekends ago, a friend of mine was visiting. She brought her 15-year-old daughter. The daughter is growing up in Berkeley, California, and she's a smart kid. She's well-read. She can talk to you about the black hole and things that I'm like, no idea what she's talking about. But when I asked her if she knew Paul Revere, she's like, not really. You know, I remember that there's this name, and you know, it didn't feel relevant to her. And I don't know, I call Paul Revere the quintessential American folk hero. He's a man, he did all these things you're going to learn about, but really why he's most well known is because 100 years after he did his famous Midnight Ride, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a poem about him, and I'm sure we all know about that poem. But that poem was written as a call to action in the face of the American Civil War. And so, anyway, that's kind of cool. But what really that brings me to is that it's really all about storytelling. And there are many stories that are being told about Paul Revere. In fact, one of these pieces of paper I have is a foreword I'm writing for a picture book that's coming out, Courtney Skinner's book, where this man is doing these new images of Paul Revere, which I think is kind of exciting. They're a different thing. But we're here to listen to Dr. Robert Martello, a professor of the history of science and technology at Olin College, and a graduate of MIT's program in the history and social science of technology. He spent, I don't know exactly how much time doing a fellowship at the Paul Revere House.
That's right, that was like a 2 year.
Two-year fellowship at the Paul Revere House. So I'm guessing there was some sort of stipend and support given. And anyway, he wrote this amazing book. And this book, to me, what's the best part of it is it's a side of Paul Revere's story that we don't know and we don't think of. And let me say, welcome Rob here to tell you that story. And thank you all for coming.
Hi there. Thank you so much. Wasn't that thrilling, by the way? We had Avery Revere come up here and talk. That's it. I mean, if I were smart, I would probably say, thank you, have a great night, right? I would just sort of leave it there and not risk messing up the excellence that we just heard. But it's been a real joy for me to research this topic and work with Avery and the others on the board of the Paul Revere Memorial Association. And as we said, this is something that I studied as a graduate student way back when. We're not going to mention years, that's too many years ago, but I studied this. This was my PhD dissertation, which I then turned into the book, right, that we have here tonight. And the more I study Paul Revere, the more I learn about him and about the connections that he has. There's really not a topic that we can't connect Paul Revere to. And let's figure out why that is the case. Let's dive right in. I just want to get started. There's also something a little sneaky in the title of my talk today. This is not the title of my book, but I'm calling it Paul Revere's Greatest Ride, which is a little controversial because his midnight ride was quite important. So let's see what you think by the end of this talk. Let's see how we feel about the different, quote, rides, right, that I'm saying that he went on. First, though, I have to say a message from Paul Revere himself. Thank you, Tales of Cape Cod, right? Paul Revere really wanted to share that. He wanted me to share that with everyone. It's just a thrill. It's an honor to be here tonight talking. Thank you to the sponsors, by the way, who made this talk possible. I'm just so delighted to be here. We couldn't ask for a better setting. Also, and thank all of you for coming on this gorgeous night, right? You're spending some of your precious, beautiful weather time here, and I think we're going to enjoy this talk. So let me just dive in. So Avery, you alluded to a poem a moment ago. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Right? I bet that there's some of us who could recite a lot of that poem, actually. Right? There's a lot going on there. Dark. Is that a little easier to see? Right? A little better contrast, maybe. Right? That's nice. And Paul Revere's Midnight Ride is of crucial importance. I would love to talk about that. I'm going to have a slide about that later, but I'm going to try to bite my tongue and not talk too much about that because we have dessert we have to get to, right? I don't want to delay us too much from the dessert, but maybe we could get into the Midnight Ride itself more in the question and answers. But I am pointing out that there is more that he did in his life, even patriotically, than the Midnight Ride itself, right? And that's what I would like to talk about today, right? So we have a statue in the North End, not far from the Paul Revere House at all. If anyone visits Boston, it's on the Freedom Trail, a short walk from the Paul Revere House. And I love the angle on this photo. In the background, you could see the Old North Church, which also plays a part in the Paul Revere story. But we're going to learn about many of the other things that he did tonight here. So I kind of want you to think about this as a story in 4 chapters, right? We're going to start with his early origins, his training in the craft tradition as a silversmith. We're going to shift to his revolutionary activities, but he wasn't just a midnight rider, even though I shouldn't say just, that was important. He was a midnight rider, but he also was called the handyman of the revolution by certain historians, and I'll talk a little bit about why that was. Afterwards, though, he returned to his shop in a new way. So I'm calling the third part, the patriot at the forge. We're going to see what he did after the war that was a little different than what he did before. And finally, the last ride of Paul Revere, he provided an essential service to his country back when he was 65 years old, when many people would be retiring. And he then was getting started on, that's what I'm calling the greatest ride of Paul Revere. So let's just dive in. So the making of a silversmith. And this image here, I could just give you a whole slide about it. Right? So we're going to start in colonial Boston. Paul Revere was born in 1735 in the north end of Boston. This is a picture of Boston from a little bit later than that. You could see there's red coats disembarking from ships at the bottom of this image here. So that tells us this was a 1775 image. So it's not exactly accurate for the Boston of Paul Revere's youth, but it's close, right? So the town of Boston would still look pretty close to this image here. Why am I using a later image of Boston? That's easy. Paul Revere made this image. This is an engraving that Paul Revere himself made. So I just thought it'd be fun to just contextualize our story by looking at Boston the way he chose to portray it, but again, years later. So he was born, though, in 1735 in Boston. The small but bustling town, right? Small in the context of the larger British Empire, large in the context of British America. For a while, it was the largest of cities before it was surpassed by New York and Philadelphia. And some of the aspects of this image that are important to this story here, you could see a lot of dense houses, right? This is looking at the north end of Boston, where Paul Revere's family lived. He lived there with his parents, and then his own house was and is in the north end of Boston. You could see the dense settling of houses. There were a lot of artisans living in the north end of Boston. It was a working area of town, a working class neighborhood. This wharf, this very long wharf jutting out, is actually unimaginatively called the Long Wharf, right, in Boston. It's still there, by the way. You could still walk on the Long Wharf. It's interesting, you could see little shops going all the way out on the wharf. Those are different shops that are working, that are facing the ocean for a reason. Boston was a mercantile town. It was really involved in trade throughout the British Empire. Ships would be coming to the beautiful natural port harbor of Boston, where it's a nice protected harbor. It was very convenient for ships to disembark and unload their cargo. So a lot of the activity in Boston, a lot of the economic activity centered around the ocean trade. Also, the social classes centered around that. Merchants were at the top of the social hierarchy. They were the wealthiest, and they had the most social status. One last thing I want to point out about the Boston of Paul Revere's youth and about this image, you could see a lot of church spires there. So religion was very important. Churches were very important. We're actually going to get back to that in this story. Paul Revere is going to have a little interaction with those churches in a little bit. So Paul Revere was born in 1735. His father was an immigrant from France. He was a French Protestant who immigrated. His father immigrated to Boston when he was only 11, and his father learned the silver working trade, and he took on his son Paul as an apprentice. Now, Paul Revere's father's name was Apollos Revere, which is a beautiful name. But Paul Revere later wrote in a letter to his cousin in France, he said, "My father was named Apollos Revere, but he changed his name to Paul Revere," and the quote is, "so the bumpkins here could pronounce it properly." Right? So there's something, so we're learning that. And I actually wish he had stayed with Apollos Revere. That's fantastic. But it does make our story, I'm going to continue referring to Paul Revere's father as Apollos, so we could mention Paul Revere, who technically was Paul Revere Jr. I'm going to call him the Paul Revere, the subject of the talk tonight. So Paul Revere literally followed in his father's footsteps. He was an apprentice to his father and learned the silver working trade from him. Most apprenticeships in this time period were about 7 years long. That's how long Paul's was supposed to be, but it was ended early, and unfortunately, when his father passed away, when Paul was around 19 or 20. So they had a little bit of a fiction at that point. Paul was still an apprentice, technically should not have been running his own shop. So what the family did was they said, well, the mother, right, Paul Revere's mother will be running the shop, and Paul will just be working there, right, until his apprenticeship is over. As you know, ruses go, this one was completely transparent, right? No one would think Paul Revere's mother was a silversmith or could run the shop, right? It was obvious that Paul Revere, right, even at age of 19, was taking on really leadership duties and was really operating as a fully fledged silversmith. But he kind of used this myth to kind of run out the rest of his apprenticeship and legally then inherit the shop when he turned 21. So at that point, he became an actual practicing silversmith in name, though he'd already been doing it for a while. So kind of interesting. And you could see he's taking on maturity and duties at a very young age, right? Not by his choice. So Paul Revere was a member of the artisan class, right? So that's a wonderful class in society at this time period. We don't have it as the same kind of class today, although some people are artisans today. But back then, the artisans were the productive middle layer of society. There were some working people, right? People who did not go through the artisan apprenticeship training experience. So working class people might work, you know, as unloading goods at the dock. Farmers were considered, right, in that lower working class. But those were not the same as the artisans. The artisans, by the virtue of their training, had a different status. Your apprenticeship as an artisan was more like going to college might be today. Someone might say, oh, I see you're a silversmith. Who did you train with? And you might say, oh, I trained under Apollos Revere. And you say, oh, wow, his work is very good. Okay, I think I know something about you now. I think I'll hire you, right? So it was your credential. It sort of gave you some status, right, with the people of the town. And then you would someday pass on your skills to your own apprentices. They use the phrase during apprenticeship, the art and mystery of the trade. And that's a really important phrase. It was well chosen, right, saying this is an art. Not anyone can do what we do. right? There's real skilled labor that we're practicing, whether you're a silversmith, a cabinet maker, right? There are so many different trades. There's other metalworking trades such as blacksmith work, tinsmiths, coppersmiths, right? You could also, go into the woodworking trades or many others. So they're saying, because I went through an apprenticeship, I have many skills, and it is an art that I am practicing. But it's the art and mystery of the trade, saying, I will not share this knowledge with anyone except my own apprentices. We're going to keep it in the family, so to speak. Even though I don't want to imply that everyone was an apprentice to their father the way Paul was. Not everyone was. But they're saying, I'm going to only pass on these skills to people who train with me and continue the artisan tradition. So the art and mystery is a way of thinking about this class of people. So Revere wasn't just any type of artisan. He was a silversmith. That was among the highest ranked in status of these artisan trades because silver working was extremely highly skilled and you needed a lot of capital, a lot of investment capital, money, to afford the equipment and the materials of silver working compared to someone who might have just worked with wood or made candles or something like that. This was much higher, right, status. We're seeing here some images of Paul Revere silver. If I had to use just one word to describe him as an artisan, that word would be versatile. He could do everything. He made over 90 types of objects throughout his silver working career, ranging from the very commonplace spoons or buckles, right, the flatware that was pretty easy to make and that most people could afford, to the much more elite coffee and tea sets you see in the right-hand corner, which were very elaborate and had engraving and lots of extra work there. He even took on very specific requests sometimes. Like he was once asked to make an ashtray out of an ostrich egg for someone. They brought him the egg and he put silver legs on it and made it an ashtray. And someone else said, could you please make me a silver chain for my pet squirrel? Right? And so we're seeing that he would basically, if someone walked into a shop and said, can you make, he would probably interrupt them right there and say, the answer is yes. Now, what do you want me to make again? Right? No, he would say, if I don't know how to make it, I'll figure it out. Right? I want as much work as I could get. Let me just move forward to just a few other things about his silver working career before we move forward. This is a maker's mark. Paul Revere had several different maker's marks. Some were his initials, some were his last name Revere. There are other maker's marks. That helps us today identify Revere silver where we could find it. There's not much of it left. A lot of it is on display in the Museum of Fine Arts, right, which is really exciting to see it there. But silversmiths were trying to protect their reputation by stamping their maker's mark into their work. This is a calling card, so to speak. He might sell a tea set to someone, and then if that person was entertaining guests using this tea set, people might say, that's a beautiful tea set. Can I just see the maker? Oh, Revere made this. Maybe I'll go to him when I need my own silver work done. So this was very important. Silversmiths did subcontract to each other a little bit. If one silversmith had too much work, they would find other silversmiths and give them a little bit of the work to do. But what's interesting is when they did this, the person who was being subcontracted, who was doing, let's say, making the handle of a teapot or something like that, they would often try to sneak their maker's mark onto the piece so they can get a little credit. And the primary silversmith, when they found that, would just smash it right out with their own, right? So sometimes we see like what looks like 3 maker's marks on top of each other because different people are trying to say, nope, I get credit for this. You're just my subcontractor. Yep, you give that to me. We can learn about the reputation of different silversmiths by the type of work they did for each other because silversmiths would only hire someone else to do something that person was excellent at because if they did a poor job, then I would look bad if I was the main silversmith. So Paul Revere's specialty was engraving. Other silversmiths hired him to do the engraving on some of their pieces. And so we just learned about that. So it's a way of knowing he had a reputation for magnificent engravings. And the image on the right of this slide is really interesting because when I was a graduate student doing work, I was in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society and I was reading through his letter book. I was reading through draft copies of all the correspondence he wrote, which is valuable. It's actually beyond value for a historian. People in that day and age would, if they were going to write a letter to someone, they would get out their letter book, which is a bound volume, so all the pages are in order, go to the next blank page, write out the letter that they're thinking of writing to someone, correct spelling errors, maybe edit the grammar a little bit, so there's cross-outs, there's fixings. Then when it's ready, they would then make a clean copy of that on a piece of paper and mail that to the person. So we have basically a letter book that's a draft copy of all the correspondence Revere had. So as a historian, that's a gold mine for me. I was reading that. And so over the day, I was like going through that. I was reading through letters, right, making notes. And then I turned the page and I found this. Just a magnificent sketch of some engraving patterns. And I was thinking like, why would this be in his letter book, right? This is amazing. It just shows this to him was like a doodle, right? He's basically, so we don't know there's no date or information about this. It's just a random drawing. You turn the page, you go right back to additional letters. Maybe he was drawing this for a client. Like maybe someone came to his shop and said, hey, I want some engraving, Revere. What do you think I should do? And he said, let me show you on this blank page of my letter book here. Maybe he was showing that to one of his apprentices to say, look, here's what I want you to do. Maybe it was a draft for himself, right? He was just saying, let me see if I could figure this out and make it work. We have no idea. But it just shows this is his own hand, right? Just shows the skill he has, right, to just do this and not treat this. This is almost like a piece of paper he might have thrown away, except it happened to be bound into a volume of other important things. So he kept it. So a few things about his silver working career, right, that we're going to build on. Before I move forward to the next phase, I just thought we should just remember Revere has a family life that's going on in the background. There is a lot of information on this slide, right, but I just wanted to tell you now a little bit about his family, so we'll carry this forward. So Paul Revere got married 2 times. His first wife was Sarah. He married at age 22, right, so in 1757. They had 8 children. So the left column here that says Sarah's children shows the children in the order they were born and the age at which they died, how old each child was when they died. So you could see the first one, Deborah, it says died at age 39, and then we have a bunch of others, down to little Isana, right, who died at age 1. Now, Mary, you notice, is in a white font, right? I only did that for the children of Paul Revere's who outlived him when he died. So of his first 8 children, only Mary was alive at the time of Paul Revere's death. And I'm getting ahead of my story now, but I just want to give you the family context now. For everything I'm talking about, all the silver work, all of the other trades we're going to see Revere does, we have to keep in mind he's running this booming household in the background. He has a wife and lots of children. So if you're reading the top part, you might be thinking, wait a minute, Rob, hold it. Sarah Revere died in 1773, his first wife. She died through complications from the childbirth of Isana. So Sarah died and Isana died shortly after, right? So that was a horrible tragedy, right? You could just imagine the sadness of that time. But then it says, he then married Rachel in 1773, the same year. And there's something interesting. That sounds a little cold, right? If you're like, wait a minute, his wife died and he's remarried by the end of the same year. Mortality was very common in this day and age. Mortality was something people came to terms with. You would just face this as just the way life was, right? No, so now, was he crushed when someone died? Of course he was, right? It was completely horrible, right, to lose a child or lose a beloved spouse. But at the same time, death was everywhere, right? People were dying very young, right? Medical, care was nowhere near what we have today. The world was a mysterious, scary place, right? And so people were dying, and people kind of had the attitude, especially in New England, life goes on, right? We need to, try and keep going. So Paul Revere remarried. He had also, at that time, there were lots of little children in his household. He was trying to run a business, so he sort of needed some help. He did, though, fall in love with his second wife, Rachel. Some surviving love poetry survives from Paul to Rachel. He really loved her. He married Rachel. So the second column shows Rachel had 8 children also, right? So Paul Revere, right? So there were, all told, 16 children were born, right, to Paul Revere through 2 wives, right? Rachel did not die as a result of childbirth. She lived to an much older age, right, than Sarah did. And you could see 4 of Rachel's children survived to the end of Paul Revere's life, although some of them died extremely young or actually during childbirth and all of this. So there's all sorts we could analyze this for the remainder of our time together this evening if I'd let us. So we have to move on. But you could see, for example, he really wanted a surviving child named John, for example. So if you look under the Rachel children, one of them died in childbirth, right, the second from the top. Then a little later, he had another John who died at age 3, right, very tragically. And then he had he named a third one John. John was a relative of his in France. So this is another common thing. To us, we might say, that seems heartless, right? You lose your child and you rename someone, right? Why would you do that, right? And it's like, of course he has the memory of those lost children, but he wanted to honor his family member and have a surviving child with that name, right? And so then the third John did survive, right, and lived longer. Okay, so anyway, let's keep this in mind as we're moving forward. So Revere has this bustling household with lots of children. Some of the sons are going to follow in his footsteps, as we'll get to soon. But on that note, let's move forward. So now let's make it to the Revolutionary War, the resistance movement going into the Revolutionary War. I want to zoom in on this painting because it's very important. So this is a painting by John Singleton Copley, a very famous, well-known painter in Boston at the time, done of Paul Revere in his silver shop. This painting is unusual in many ways, but I'm going to quickly tell this story just by telling it in an interesting, weird, backwards order. When I was a graduate student, at one point I did give a talk at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I was so excited. Avery's father, right, Paul Jr., I think they called him Junior, right? I think others might have called him that, right? But your father was there. I think maybe that was his nickname. They called him Junior. But Avery's father, Paul Revere, was present at my talk. I was a young graduate student. I was intimidated, but he was this friendly, charming person. And so when I went up to him after my talk, he said, "Hey, thanks for the talk. I loved it, Rob." And I said, "It's my pleasure, Mr. Revere." And I said, "I always wanted to say that. Like, thank you, Paul Revere," right? It's like most historians don't get to do that, right? But I said, "Mr. Revere, I have a question for you. I heard a rumor during my research that Paul Revere's wife did not like this famous painting. Like when he unveiled this painting for her, that she didn't like it. Like, that's what I heard." And he looked at me and said, "Son, not only did she not like it, she hated it," right? And once she saw it, she put it up in the attic. Right, she made him to just get it out of my sight, put it in the attic, where it lay until it was hidden up there in the attic for many years, until one later point, one of his adult grandchildren went up there and saw the great-grandchildren shooting spitballs at it. Right, they found the thing. Right, so now this is a family story. We have no way of verifying whether it's true or not, but it's an interesting question. I like to tell that story just because you say, why would anyone hate this painting? Right, it's actually extremely well rendered. Right, there's great detail. It's even nicer to see it. Well, wait. Yes, Avery. It's definitely true. Avery, I'm going to quote you on that. Okay, that's it. I no longer have to waffle around when I give this talk, right? I could say, we know this is true, right? So why, right? There's nothing bad about this painting. John Singleton Copley was excellent. He was very skilled. Now, what we could maybe guess why she would hate this painting. Maybe a little bit of context would be useful. Paintings were expensive, not a surprise, especially by a master such as John Singleton Copley. Copley came to Paul Revere throughout his career and bought a lot of things from him, mostly frames, copper or silver frames for small portraits. And as many people did, he didn't pay Revere at the time of purchase. He would say, put it on my bill, right? Let's keep a tab going, right? So I owe you for this. I'll pay you at some future point. And there was nothing unusual about that. So time passed, the debt grew, right? He was buying more things from Revere and not paying for them at the time. So at one point, Copley approached Revere and said, "Mr. Revere, I have an offer for you. If I paint your portrait, can we call it even?" Right? So instead of paying you, can I give you a painting of yourself, right? And he must have said, "Yes, I will accept that in payment," because the debt is canceled at this point. So Revere posed for the portrait and sat and took it. This is almost unheard of at the time because portraits were, as I mentioned, were expensive and were the provenance of the upper classes. Right, so portraits at this time were made of usually merchants, maybe of lawyers, maybe of famous politicians or statesmen who were representing themselves in all their finery. So you might have a merchant wearing a powdered wig, and usually they'd be wearing robes, right? Some kind of very fancy velvet clothing, and they would be doing very symbolic things. A merchant was often painted at a window, gesturing out the window, and you might see a ship in the distance, right? To say, "Yes, this is a ship." John Adams was portrayed with his hand on top of some law books, right? There are different books, right, where he is, right? So they're trying to make this very symbolic. So we could picture Paul Revere's wife, right? Waiting for him to come home, right? And he says, "Here you go, I got my portrait taken," and you could picture her saying, "Oh, Paul, you're wearing your vest, right? This is your working vest. You're sitting there at your table and there's tools on the table, right? For crying out loud, your shirt is unbuttoned in this picture. Do I see dirt under your fingernail?" Right, which there is, by the way, if you could see the detail. She's like saying, "This isn't one of those nobility pictures, right? This is just you being you, right? What are you doing?" Right? We could just picture her disappointment, right, at seeing this, expecting this to be some kind of upper class portrayal, right? And so you could imagine why that might be a shock to her, a disappointment, if we buy into this family legend, right? That she might not have wanted that because she's used to seeing the portraits of the rich and powerful looking like the leaders of society. But what Copley did here is beyond value that we can give it. This is an unbelievable image. It's literally the only image of an artisan in his trade, right? Practicing his trade. There's one or two pictures of someone like an artisan who later became famous, who either wants to look like they're rich and famous, or who's dressing up in a costume to look like themselves as a blacksmith. There's one called Pat Lyon at the Forge, which is of a man who had started out life as a blacksmith. He went on to become very rich, and then he sort of dressed up as a blacksmith again later in life, right? But he's doing that as like a performance. Here, it's almost like a photograph of what Paul Revere would look like if we visited him in his shop. So we see Paul Revere on a very shiny table. This is probably not the working table he would do work on. This is probably the table that he sat across from customers when they came in to order from him, just because it's a little too clean, right? But those tools there are actually engraving tools, right? Now, if you remember before, I mentioned that Paul Revere's specialty was engraving, right? That was his greatest skill and what he was known for the most, right, in the town. What we're seeing here is you notice he's holding a teapot in his hand, and it's on that thing that looks like a pillow. That's actually a sandbag. So what they would do is they would put the silver piece on the sandbag to brace it when they were driving an engraving tool into it. You wanted it to be perfectly still so they could make a very smooth and clean line, right, when they did. They don't want it moving all around or trying to hold it. So they would put it on that bag. The teapot is perfectly smooth. It is not engraved yet. And there are engraving tools on the table. Paul Revere is holding a teapot that's finished except for that finishing detail that he's about to add to it, his specialty. He's thinking, what am I going to do with this teapot? How am I going to engrave it? I've got my tools here. I've got the teapot. What do I do? Remember, I mentioned that a lot of these paintings were very symbolic. The symbolism is often centered in the hands. So Paul Revere's hands are doing something very important. One is holding his head. One is holding his work. We're kind of saying this act of creation of an artisan is an act of thinking, right? This is not manual labor. This is not some sweaty person, right, like laboring away with his muscles. This is someone using his mind, right? His work is actually intellectual. There's thought here. And if you look, the best detail, one of my favorite things about this, if you look at the shininess of the silver teapot, the hand of the maker is literally reflected in his work, right? So we're saying Revere's hand is like you could see his handiwork, right, in what he produces. John Singleton Copley is celebrating the artisan in this picture, right? He's saying this is an important trade, right? These people are doing work that is thoughtful, right, that is skillful, that matters, right? These are not someone less than the gentry that I paint all the time. He's just as good. He's just as important. So as you could tell, I absolutely adore this painting, and I could say that the Museum of Fine Arts agrees with me. They've put it in a position of honor in their holdings. When you walk from the main galleries into the American wing, you're greeted by this painting, right? So it's like, welcome to the American wing. Here is Paul Revere, and his silver is all around us, right? So they are aware, right, of the importance of this piece here. So I just hope that you, if anyone ever makes their way over to Boston, you take some time and look at the original, because no projection can do justice, right, to all the details in this. So anyway, this is Paul Revere in his silver shop in 1768. This is during the time when the resistance movement is starting to pick up. So I mentioned before that Paul Revere has been called the handyman of the revolution. It seems whenever the patriots had a task that needed some really thoughtful work, they usually went to him. He was asked at one point to set up a gunpowder mill, a gunpowder producing factory in Massachusetts, something he never knew how to do, but he traveled to Pennsylvania, observed how one worked, and replicated it up there. He was asked to cast cannon, right, to work in a foundry. They said, you know how to work with metal. Can you build us some cannon? He worked with others and produced cannon. He did a lot of engraving for the Patriots. He engraved currency notes for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and he engraved propaganda, such as this famous Boston Massacre print, right, that's in a lot of school books and on a lot of patriotic documents, right? This is basically telling the Patriots side of their story of the Boston Massacre. So there's a lot of work that he did time and time again for the Patriots when they needed someone who was really gifted and skillful. As a silversmith, he was in a good position in society. He would be doing a lot of work for the upper classes who could afford his expensive silver, but he was a working man who knew the people in the lower classes too. He would live amongst them in the North End, and he would hire some of them or subcontract with others. So this is someone who was a great connecting person throughout the levels of society, and that made him an excellent midnight rider. So he actually did a lot of courier work, right, for the Patriots throughout his career, not just the famous one on the 18th of April in 1775, but other times. He traveled as far as Philadelphia, right? He traveled throughout the countryside delivering messages. One thing we should keep in mind about this service, he was not simply like a postal carrier. I don't want to demean postal carriers, but he was not only handing over a message and taking one in reply. He would interpret that message, it took so long to travel that you wouldn't just want to hand over a piece of paper and wait to write a new one. People would say, Mr. Revere, tell us more about this message. What actually is going on? So he would help to tell the story and not just deliver the correspondence. And then he would return and explain to the people in Boston who he spoke with and what they had conversations about. It was a very important job. This is a map of Boston at the time. It looks very different than Boston does today. And as I told you, I'm like biting my tongue here because I want to tell you the long story of the Midnight Ride, but we'll never get out of here if I do that. So if anyone is curious about that, ask me that during the Q&A at the end. I would love to say more about that. But for now, let me go on because I keep saying I'm going to tell you more about Paul Revere and like this new side of him. So there on the left, we see an image of a traditional artisan as people saw them, someone using a hammer and swinging it. Paul Revere, after the Revolution, was saying, I feel like I've served my country well. I've done some great patriotic duty, the Midnight Ride, and lots of other things. We are the victors. We are now in charge of this new country that we're building here. This is very exciting. I am ready to move across and become one of the leaders of our society. I feel like I've paid my dues. I've showed my qualifications. I'm ready. I'm ready. Let me be a leader. He tried and tried and tried and failed to ascend into the upper classes. He tried to be a merchant. Other merchants would not give him any credit. They said, we don't recognize your name. We don't feel comfortable loaning you money. You have to pay with cash on delivery. And no merchant operated that way, so he couldn't do it. He tried to be a customs inspector in the town of Boston, a very high prestige appointed position. They said, we don't know who you are. We're just going to find a merchant to do this. He even tried to be the first director of the Federal Mint, where you'd think a silversmith would be extremely qualified to do that. But again, they said, well, we don't recognize your name. We're not going to go with an artisan on this. We want someone who's more intellectual. They didn't quite say it that way, but that was the message. They said, oh, we don't know who you are. No, rejected. Rejection, rejection, rejection. So somewhat in defeat, and we know this from correspondence where he's not happy about these things, he returns to his shop. And that's where the story really goes, right? So let's go to chapter 3. Now he returns to his shop saying, I wanted to be a societal leader. I couldn't do it by taking on a strictly leadership position. How can I do that through my work? So he returns to his silver work, but things have changed. The top image is just showing how styles have changed. This is the Federalist style silver, very different than their other ones. The rounder teapot that he was holding in that portrait has now gone to this more geometric type of teapot, right? So he was very gifted in this style. But more importantly for our purposes tonight, he imported from England something called a flatting mill or a rolling mill. And it looks like here, you could see on this not great quality image here. It's basically like two rolling pins, right, that are held very close to each other, and each rolling pin has a handle on it. So in the past, before this piece of equipment, whenever he wanted to make anything that would use flat silver, he would take a bar of silver and hammer it. He would heat it and hammer it until it was the width he wanted, and he would have to polish out all of the dents and bumps and measure it and make sure it was uniformly thick and hammer it some more. That was 90% of the labor that went on in his silver shop, was hammering silver into sheets. So he's a very sharp man, very entrepreneurial. He said, if I could quickly make sheets, then my skilled workers could do the important types of work, the engraving, the seaming, joining the pieces together, curving and making it look like the final piece, instead of all of us hammering all the time just to produce those sheets. This is a piece of technology that achieves that. So what they would do for this is there's two rolling pins with handles on them. He would take a bar of silver and heat it up and then feed it between the two rolling pins, and two strong apprentices would turn those two handles. And so the heated bar of silver, it's almost like Play-Doh, like when you're a kid, you play with clay or something. The little bar of silver would get squished a little bit as it went through the rollers, and would become a little flatter, right, and a little wider. He would take it back out and heat it up a second time, and by turning a screw on the top, make the rolling pins go slightly closer together, and then feed it through again. Heat up the bar, move the pins, feed it through again. By doing this repeatedly, right, he's taking a bar of silver and making it a uniform sheet. If those two rollers are parallel to each other, if you get them exactly aligned and parallel, the sheet is going to be the perfect width. It's not going to be thicker on one side than the other. This was a game changer. When he did this, his output increased fourfold. 400%, you could say. Right, so suddenly, he just has two apprentices turning out enormous number of sheets, and his skilled workers are doing the other types of jobs, and suddenly he's making a lot of money. Right, so I can't say that he invented this piece of equipment. He did not. He imported it from England, though it was illegal to export it from England. He had to illegally import it. He said, he said to someone there, to the ship captain, could you please write on the box agricultural goods, right, or something like that, because I don't want to get in trouble. And the person actually wrote back and said, don't tell me how to do my job. I know how to get this stuff out of England, right? And so they snuck it out of England. And so he did identify this opportunity. He found the equipment, he bought it, he figured out how to use it, and he starts reaping the rewards. So now his very profitable shop is saying, excellent, what can we do? Like, silver is a great field, we're making a lot of money, but there's only so much silver we could sell in the town of Boston. Like, we need to expand in some way. The next thing that he did was he said, silver is something that's mostly affordable to the upper classes. It's very expensive. Iron is something we all use, right? I can take some of the profits, this is what Revere is thinking, I could take the profits from my silver shop and build a huge iron furnace. He did it in his backyard, the backyard of his property, of his shop. And he said, we could just purchase some iron from some local ironworks, heat it so it becomes molten iron, pour it into a mold, and it'll cool and take on the shape of that mold. And then I can sell these goods, whatever I have the molds to make, I can sell to the people of Boston to use as pieces of stoves. So just the parts of a stove. Fireplace backs, basically just a piece of iron behind your fireplace to protect the bricks from the heat. Window weights, very simple, just weights to counterbalance the weight of your window. Fireplace tools, I think pokers and things like that. He started making a large quantity of iron goods and started selling them now to the people of Boston, and now everyone is buying, not just the people who are wealthy enough to afford silver. While doing this, his oldest son, Paul Revere Jr., took over his silver shop. So it's a really interesting model. Like Paul says, I'm going to move on to the new field of iron. Son, you run the old shop. Keep the profits coming. Like, keep that shop going. Let's keep making sales. But I'm going to direct my attention to this new venue. So it's really interesting. It shows how innovative he is. So now he's selling silver and iron, and he says, this is great. What else can I do? Right? I want more. I'm very, entrepreneur. There's more opportunities here. So as a few years passed after he started this in 1788, he said, what's another thing I could use my furnace to do? Bells. So he got into this field by a fortunate accident. The bell of his own church cracked, and all of the elders of the church, including Paul Revere as one of them, said, let's take up a collection. We're going to have to send away to England. We're going to have to buy another bell. It'd be very expensive to buy it, very expensive to ship it. And he was in the back of the room, and he said, I think I could make that for us. I think I could make it much cheaper, and we wouldn't have to pay any transportation costs. Bells are not the same as iron. And yet he figured it out. So he went to he got some patterns and made some molds. He did some experimenting. His first bells apparently were a little shrill, as we might expect. But before you knew it, he was turning out these bells that could range from 100 or 200 pounds to 2,000 pounds or more. And he was now, and remember I said before, the churches were very important in Boston. Some people said there were places in Boston where you can hear literally dozens of different church bells. Like, each bell had its own unique sound. And people learned to identify, the tone and the pitch of their own church's bells. Bells were used to send fire alarms. Bells were used to call people to mass, right? They were used for so many different things, right? And so this was a very audible version of like a business card for him. Like, if everyone said, oh, that's a beautiful bell. Who made that bell? Paul Revere made it. It's like, wow. This is a gifted maker, right? This is a craftsman here. So he went into the bronze bell casting field in 1792, and he was great, right? He was making a lot of money. It was very high profile. What does he do? He says, okay, what else can I do? At this point, his second oldest son, Joseph Warren Revere, started taking over the iron casting shop so now he has one son working in the silver shop, one son continuing to make iron, and Paul Revere, the dad, keeps moving forward. So he's the innovator of the family, saying, I'm going to try this new thing. He said, if I know how to work with bronze, and I know how to make giant molds out of bronze, bells are not that different from cannon. Now, actually, they're quite different in some ways, right? You have to shoot the cannon, right? It's got a lot of stresses on it, but it's still made the same bronze. In fact, in Europe, when invading armies were conquering a territory, they might pull down the church bells and recast them into cannons, right? Like there's exactly the same metal, although he changed his formula a little bit, his recipe for bronze. But he started working for the Navy, making lots of cannon and selling it to Navy buyers. And so he loved working for the Navy for several reasons. One was, this is patriotic again. He's helping his country, right? He feels very proud about this. Secondly, the Navy is an ongoing customer, right? If he sells a church bell to a church, they might say, we love the bell, thank you so much. And that's the end, right? No further sales, right? They have a bell, they're happy. If he sells 10 cannon to the Navy, they say, this is fantastic, we want another dozen, please, right? And so on and so on and so on. So he said, this is a great organization to work for. I would like to continue my contracting. So he said in letters to the Navy, I'll continue making you any cannon you want. Is there anything else you happen to need? They said, well, we have an unlimited need for bolts and spikes, things that are called fasteners, right? So on a ship, there's all this timber that needs to be held together. You don't want to use iron to do that. You don't want it to rust, right? So then he experimented with bronze for a while and then said, no, copper actually has better properties than bronze. Bronze is an alloy of different metals. It's copper plus tin and some other things. In this case, right, he said, pure copper works great. I'm going to roll out lots and lots of copper. I'm going to make tons of it. And again, the Navy keeps buying cannon, keeps buying copper, and he's saying, this is fantastic. So now we're picturing Revere almost like a corporation, right? He's got the silver division, the iron division, the bell division, the cannon division, the bolts and spikes. He's working all these things, making income from all of them. He's doing very well financially, and he's very happy about it. And this gets us to the part of the story where we're ready for one last piece, right? The last ride of Paul Revere. This image, by the way, I have it on the next slide a little smaller, but this is a portrait of Paul Revere made in 1800. So his wife would not put this one in the attic, right? This is Paul Revere looking kind of like prosperous, right? He's in profile, he's wearing fancy clothes, right? It's a great portrait, right? I like it a lot less than the first one, I have to tell you, right? I just love the art, embracing the artisan heritage, but this is Paul Revere at age 65. When many people, you could imagine, starting to think about retirement. Actually, to be honest, at this point, mortality is taking its toll on most people. Right? If we remember the ages of Paul Revere's children when they died, there were a bunch in the 30s and 50s, right? So he's at age 65 saying, I want to do more. Is there any other product that the Navy needs me to produce? And they said, well, there is one, sheet copper for ships. But this one was hard. This was the high-tech product of its day. So the idea is when you have a wooden-hulled ship sailing in warm waters, especially in the Mediterranean, all sorts of bad things happen to it. The least bad thing is barnacles stick to it, right? Once you get a lot of barnacles on a ship, they start dragging mats of seaweed, right? So these ships with these big seaweed mats are just not maneuverable, they're not fast. But way worse than that is something called the Teredo shipworm, which is a mollusk that it lays eggs on the side of a ship, and then the eggs hatch and they burrow in, these little worms burrow into the wooden hull, making it like Swiss cheese, right? So these ships that are going in would just have these shipworms. When you bring it into a harbor, they would migrate to other ships, right? Before you know it, all the wooden-hulled ships would have this problem, right? And ships would have to come into dry dock for months every couple of years to get people with torches to burn out all of these mollusks and repair the planks, put new planks on. So the British Navy figured out a thin sheeting of copper around the outside would prevent any of this problem. No barnacles, no shipworms. Copper is toxic to sea creatures. If a barnacle tries to stick to it, it will die and it will fall off. The copper is thin, so you wanted it to be very malleable, very flexible, so you could hammer it in small sheets all around under the waterline, and then the copper would last for between 5 and 10 years before it corrodes, and at that point you can replace it in about 3 weeks or so. So this is now a much better way of keeping your ships afloat rather than in dry dock all the time. England figured out how to make copper sheeting. America could not do it. So the first Secretary of the Navy under President John Adams, the Secretary was Benjamin Stoddert, if you're interested, he went to 2 different groups of people and said, can I give you a loan of money, and could you please learn how to make copper sheeting? Both of them failed. They took the money, they spent it, they couldn't, they said, sorry, we're making things that are brittle, right, they're not working, right. Finally, Paul Revere, just the right time, his timing was perfect for once in his life, wrote a letter saying, hey, are there any other products I could make? Here's a list of all the work I've done. And so Benjamin Stoddert, the Secretary of the Navy, said, Revere, I'll give you a loan of $10,000 if you can use it to figure out how to roll copper into sheets. Right? And so this was the break he wanted. He said, no other American could do this. And a relation with England, where we're buying our sheets, is getting worse and worse by the year. In fact, the War of 1812 was on the horizon. So they're saying, we're buying this product from England. We may be at war with them soon. So first of all, we'll never be able to buy from them again if we're at war. Secondly, we need these ships to break blockades and to conduct the war, and we can't do this without the sheeting. Revere, can you help us? Revere went to the town of Canton and purchased some land that had, this is, by the way, another Revere sketch. He drew this himself, right? So there was a river on this land that had some mills. There were some water mills in the water. And he said, if I'm going to roll copper into sheets, I know how a silver rolling mill works, but I don't want to do this with manual labor. I want water power for this. So he purchased some land with a river, with sort of like a little river flowing through it, and some water wheels already in the river, not used for rolling metal, but he said, I can modify those. But the thing that he started with was his exact same silver rolling mill. He said, let me do a proof of concept. I'm going to take some raw copper and use my little tiny silver rolling mill and make some sheets just to show that I know how to do it, and then I'll scale up and do it big time, right, on my property here, right? And so a great quote that I love, right, from Paul Revere, right, around this time of when he was in 1800, Revere writes, it was a secret, so copper rolling is what he's talking about. He's saying copper rolling was a secret in Europe that lay in but very few breasts. I determined, if possible, to gain the secret. I have the satisfaction to say that after a great many trials and very considerable expense, I have so far attained my wishes. So less than 1 year after getting that loan, right, Revere managed to start rolling copper into sheets. Then he started scaling up the process. He said, let me use the water power, let me hire more workers, let me move my operations from Boston to Canton, and now let's really turn out some copper. He actually turned out enough copper to repay his debt within a couple of years. So all $10,000 was repaid by just saying, I'm going to pay it in copper, right, and we'll just keep track of it, and then when I hit $10,000, we'll call it even, and then at that point afterwards, you can pay me for the copper, and we'll continue to conduct business. He was the first copper roller in America. So this was a very exciting opportunity for him. Now, a few years later, we see this in the USS Constitution's logbook. It said, the carpenters gave 9 cheers, which were answered by the seamen and the caulkers, because they had in 14 days completed coppering the ship with copper made in the States. So you see how even the people working on the this is the famous USS Constitution. It's still there. It's the oldest commissioned warship in the world that's still afloat, by the way. So it's there in the Charleston Navy Yard. And so the workers there were actually aware of where their copper came from, and they were proud of it. Right? This was a patriotic service. Right? They were saying, okay, if we get blockaded, Revere can make copper. We have lots of shipwrights who can make the rest of the ship, and we could build a navy and break the blockade if we have to, right? So this was the final step in America's Navy self-sufficiency that Paul Revere was able to figure out. So this is, by the way, the USS Constitution. You can kind of see, right, it's painted in a beautiful black and brown, and then there's copper below the waterline on the bottom. So they're still working, and they're very proud of this copper. Right now they pull, so now the original copper is long gone. They replace it, though, every 10 years, and they pull the sheets off, and it's very important. They're aware of the importance of this copper. This was the high-tech product of its age. And so the story sort of ends there. That's the last new product that Revere made, although he did find a few uses for this latest product. So he said copper sheeting going to naval vessels, also merchant vessels, is great. What else could I use my copper rolling to do? So he used it for the sheathing of domes of state houses in Boston and in New York, right? So sometimes they used to say it was made of gold. Copper also looks beautiful, and it's cheaper, right, than gold. He made copper products, pots and pans and things like that. If you've heard of Revereware, right, that's a branch of Revere Copper and Brass. It was sold off to different companies. So today, I don't even know which company owns that name anymore. But if you trace it all the way back, right, the first Revereware was made by Paul Revere, right, and his own company. The upper right picture is fascinating. That is a Robert Fulton steamboat. So Robert Fulton said, Mr. Revere, I heard that you are rolling copper into sheets. I need thicker copper for my boilers. Do you think you could roll, instead of like very thin flexible sheets, 1 to 3 inch thick sheets and curve them so they become boilers? This was not his first steamboat. Robert Fulton's first steamboat used boilers from England, from London, but he said that's extremely expensive and I would much rather have a reliable supply here. And yet again, Revere did it. He said, it's not the way I'm used to making copper, but I can figure that out. Remember what I said about Revere, versatile. If you say, Revere, can you make, he'll just say yes. And then say, okay, what did I just get myself into, right? And then figure it out. The final picture is not a product, but it's an interesting story. Paul Revere sent his second oldest son, Joseph Warren Revere, on America's first mission of industrial espionage. This might not seem like a very noble calling, but Revere was proud of it. To him, this was a patriotic duty. He sent his son to London and said, "Son, could you go over there and pretend to be a merchant and go to some of the copper manufactories and tell them you would like to buy some of their copper sheeting, but before you buy it, you'd like to look at their operations and make sure that they're okay. And when you're there, answer this list of questions," right? And so we get to see, he's saying, do they feed the copper sheets into the rollers lengthwise or diagonally? And how many passes do they make? And do they do this or that? And this was, again, a guarded technological secret in England. And Joseph Warren Revere succeeded. That picture on the lower right is a sketch made by Joseph Warren Revere that he got back to his father. So he sketched it in there. And the idea of this sketch is saying, hey, Dad, we don't need one rolling mill to drive the bottom roller and a second water wheel to drive the top roller. Look at this. They have gears, right? You could have one wheel in the water and it drives the bottom roller, and then the gears on it drive the top roller. So that was an important detail, right, that Revere was not doing. He needed two wheels, and that was very complicated. This was a way of doing it much more simply. So he managed to smuggle this and a lot of other knowledge out from England. And Paul Revere thought, this is great. You know, I'm helping my country catch up with England and narrow their technological advantage, right? So they don't have this monopoly on this. So that is basically the conclusion, right? So we could just get a few closing thoughts here. Paul Revere retired from the business in 1811. Joseph Warren, an extremely capable, competent man, took over at that point. Revere lived about 7 years more than that. He died at 1818, 83 years old. So that's partly why so few of his children outlived him, right? He was very long-lived. He had 5 of his 16 children alive at the time of his death, but the number of grandchildren, because not some of the ones who had died before his death had children before they passed away. So he had more than 50 grandchildren by that point. We don't even know exactly how many, because some of them used the same names. The records are a little confusing. Minimum of 50, right? A big, booming, thriving family with all these children, right, having their own children, and so on and so on. And his company, Revere and Sons, flourished under Joseph Warren's leadership. So it just did extremely well. They went into new fields. They made different kind of copper products, right? And they now have Revere copper products in Rome, New York. I mentioned already the Revereware line was sort of spun off, and it's still famous now. Right, and the property that Revere made his mill on is now a historic site. It's a Heritage Center site in Canton, Massachusetts. And by the way, that is the third and final portrait we have of Paul Revere. So that portrait was commissioned from Stewart in 1813. I think Joseph Warren may have sort of bought that, right, as a gift for his father, right, you know, and sort of had him painted. So we get to see Revere at 3 stages of his life. So here he is, right, near the end. Right? And so I just like to close my talk by just saying, you know, we are lucky. We're here on Cape Cod, and we are so close to all of these historical locations and all these stories that I was telling you about. So we have the Paul Revere House, where, again, 2 of the people in this room are on the board of directors of that. Right? The Paul Revere House is on Boston's Freedom Trail, which is the top middle image. So it'll take you right to the Paul Revere House, where you can learn a lot about him and about his work. They have some of his silver there. The USS Constitution, right, is in Charleston, but it's also on the Freedom Trail. And they really celebrate Paul Revere there. They have Paul Revere, they have like sort of plaques to him like in the museum. They talk about the importance of his copper, and you can get a tour of the ship. If you're interested in the Revolutionary War itself, Lexington and Concord, right, are not that far from us. There's another picture of the statue, and again, the Old North Church in the background. And Paul Revere is buried in the old granary burying ground right off of the Boston Commons, right, so very close to that. So we are lucky right here. We are fortunate. We're able to see any of these sites in person and really get more of the story from them. So I think I'm going to stop there and say thank you very much for coming tonight, and I'd love to take some questions. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So maybe I'll take a few questions, and then we could turn in and break for a little dessert or something. But yes, I see the first question right here.
Where did he get the copper?
Where did Paul Revere get his copper? That is a fantastic question. You actually put your finger on one of the limiting factors of his whole operation. Limits of copper continually made him have to stop work. So he got his favorite place to get copper was from imports from places like Turkey or Spain or South America, right? So there were copper mines in those locations, and they would occasionally ship them to America. He had people waiting on the docks in Boston, and he had purchasing agents in New York looking out for any new shipment of copper so he could bid on it. But those were unreliable. You couldn't always count on a shipment of copper. So then going down the line of his preferences, he sometimes invested, he didn't really technically invest, but he bought some copper from American copper mines, but those were less good. Those often had great copper until they dug deeper than the water table, and then the copper was contaminated, right, with arsenic and with different things. Some of them were poisons, and others were just impurities. So that copper he did not enjoy as much. It was much harder to work. His least favorite type of copper was called old copper, which is kind of what it sounds like, recycled copper. So it's really funny. I talk in my book actually a little bit about Revere is by accident a bit of an environmentalist, right? He is not saying I am trying to protect copper mines or something like that, but he's saying copper is very hard to get our hands on. Once we have some, we need to get as much use as we can out of it. So why did I say it was his least favorite? Because he often found that there were, again, things like iron nails, right, in the copper. He bought some from the West Indies, where they had big copper stills for the molasses manufacturing plants and things like that. He just bought it from around the town of Boston. And one time I was asked to come to the Massachusetts Historical Society, and they had this really nice magnet there. And they said, Rob, this magnet is a part of the Revere archives. We think that he was playing with this with his kids, right, a little toy. And I said, no, I could tell you exactly what he used that magnet for. He was looking for iron in his copper, right? Iron could ruin the whole batch, right? If he let some iron get in there, forget about it, right? It's lost. So he would be using everything he could to try and pull every speck of iron out of that copper. But even so, when he built something out of old copper, he said some of the time it would break, right? He would just do it and then test it, and then it would not hold up. He missed some of the stuff. So this was something he was always trying to purchase more and more of it if he could. That's it. How about up here?
Did he gain his respect as a result of all of these incredible industrial adventures?
Did he? It's almost like I'm paying you two to ask these questions, right? So did he gain respect, right? Remember, because you're remembering that early part where he's saying, please give me the appointment. Rejected, rejected. At the end of his life, the answer is a resounding yes, right? One of his favorite moments, right, was when he was working with that first Secretary of the Navy, Benjamin Stoddert, right? And he was doing that, and he was like sending him copper, and finally said, Mr. Stoddert, I have succeeded in producing this copper. Benjamin Stoddert wrote a letter back and said, thank you very much, Paul Revere, Esquire. So he gave him the gentleman's title, right? And then Paul Revere at that point started using that title, said, hi, Paul Revere, Esquire, I'm writing to you, right? So you could just see his pride. In this case, like, he is a patriot through and through. He loves his country, and this is not just an act that he's putting on. His correspondence makes this clear. He is always trying to help out through charitable actions, through service. He really wants to make his country better. He also is an innovator. He loves like rolling up his sleeves and figuring out the new thing. And as I mentioned before, when you look too much like a laboring person, it didn't help your rise into the upper classes. So these two interests, right, rolling up your sleeves and getting something done and trying to be a leader in society, they were sometimes at odds with each other. But through this patriotic work, he did them both at the same time. So by being the innovator who can do something that no one else could, it actually worked out for the country better, right, that he did this, right? Other people could not have rolled copper into sheets, whereas other people could have held those offices that he was trying to hold. So absolutely, yes. He was also financially successful by the end. So he was a prosperous man in town, and he was sponsoring certain things and donating to charities. So he had an excellent reputation by the end. Thank you very much. Yeah, how about back here?
I'm forgetting the book, but Malcolm Gladwell, in one of his early books, wrote that Dawes didn't know people, and Revere's ride was successful in getting the army together because he knew exactly which house to go to. He'd gone to 7 of his parents' societies.
Yeah.
Is that true?
That part, yes. So you're mentioning, right, I think that book is The Tipping Point, right? Is that right? And Malcolm Gladwell uses Paul Revere as an example of the person called the connector, right? He has two, one is the maven, or I forget what, but one type of person is the connector who knows everyone and is networked and is connecting. And that is, and in this case, like, I'm not sure about the Dawes part of that, right? So I am not an expert enough to say, right? So I don't want to say a bad thing about the Dawes part, but the Revere part is 100% accurate, right? But Paul Revere First of all, as I mentioned, was in the middle of society. So the artisans were the middle layer of society. There were gentry above them, and there were working class people below them. They were sort of the top of the working classes, right, were the artisans. And he, among the artisans, was very well respected. And then in the patriot times, he was a very active patriot. Yes, and he was a member of different groups, the Loyal Nine, the Sons of Liberty, right, a bunch of other, these correspondence committees. So he knew many, many people. And what one other historian, not me, did some research and said, Revere had a way of turning associates into clients of his, turning clients into associates, right? So he was always able to work things. So he might be on a committee with someone, and the next thing you know, they're buying silver from him, right? Or he might have a customer, right, who's buying silver from him, and then Paul Revere is lobbying that person, is joining him on the committee. So he's able to use all these different ways of knowing people to reinforce themselves, right, and to do that. Very social person, right, very well connected. How about up here next? Yeah.
I lived in Sharon, Massachusetts, next to Canton.
Yes.
We were always told that a lot of iron from Lake Massacre in Sharon were used for cannonballs.
So the iron from that lake, right, is being used. So that's a different version of the question I had before. Like where do we get your copper? Where do we get the iron from, right, is another question. And there was one type of iron called bog iron. That's what you're talking about. So yes, right, sometimes, like iron is often in ores, right? So you think of an iron mine, people are mining it, and it's like a rocky ironish mix, and you go through these processes, right, and you get it out, you smelt it, and you get the iron out. Bog iron kind of precipitates out of the bog, and you can get it from the bottom. It's an easier way to get iron, but more limited in quantity. But yes, some iron was coming from these bogs, that's right, or lakes in this case. Maybe one or two more, I don't want to keep us from the next part. How about back here?
And so you mentioned all these businesses that you had. Again, you found the time before the revolution to do a long rise to the investment.
Yes.
How did that happen? It's not a new things, right? Those rides.
Yeah, so the famous rides prior to the revolution are clearly taking him away from his business, right, you're saying, right? And so before the revolution, right, he was only working as a silversmith, right? So this is prior to all the other endeavors, but that doesn't matter for your question. Silver working was beyond a full-time job, right? He was working all the time, right? And this was absolutely a time drain. He writes about that a tiny bit, right? Mentioning this is not, when he does a patriotic ride, there is some cost he's incurring, right? So he's doing the best he can to let the shop keep working. He has his son, right, Paul Jr., right? So that's his most trusted person taking over. He's got skilled workers who he's hoping are keeping working and everything like that. However, he would mention, right, the productivity would go down when he went on these rides. No one else could be counted on to truly maintain productivity while he was away. That might be a week, it might be longer than a week. So during these times, he basically was explaining to the Patriot leaders, I'm losing money, right? I'm basically giving you a donation of my time that is not a zero-cost item. He did this in part because he was asking for expenses, right? So say, can you reimburse my expenses? And sometimes there'd be some hemming and hawing, right? And remember, this is not a well-organized organization. It's not as if they have a budget. They'd be saying, we can't really pay your expense. He'd say, look, I'm taking a beating over here, right? I'm paying laborers, I've got jobs I'm not filling, could you at least pay my expenses and maybe a little for my time? And they kind of went back and forth on this. So the answer is, it was a problem, right, that he saw, and it tells you about his patriotism, right? He kept doing it. He didn't say, forget it, no pay, no ride, I'm done here. Nope, he kept on doing it, right? But it was a cost. He was not independently wealthy and able to just sort of maintain operations. Maybe I love all these questions here. How about I'll go here first and I'll go back that way.
Do you know if any of Paul Revere's plating processes on the ships began playing a role when they began ironclad ships, during the Civil War or future and the Navy?
Yeah, were the copper rolling techniques useful, right, for the ironclads and all that? I think indirectly, yes. Right, so directly, we're both, when you say that, I'm picturing a very direct thing, ooh, roll copper, let's do the same thing for iron. Not quite. Iron has very different properties, it behaves differently. But when Paul Revere is talking about this, the reason why the other people in America couldn't figure this out, he was struggling with with modern day metallurgical principles, things like annealing, right, and the concept of malleability, right, and he occasionally even uses these words, although he misspells them all the time, right, and he doesn't know how to spell malleable to save his life, right, but he's trying to say, look, when you heat something, too much, it gets soft. And when you hammer it too much, it gets brittle. But if it's, and he's trying to say, we can't have it too soft because the sheet will fall off the ship. And we can't have it too brittle because it'll shatter when you try and hammer it. So you need to go back and forth between these. And so he's describing this idea of work hardening, a term he did not know, right? And these principles carried forth into ironworking. But it was not as if it was a direct, like, let's move from copper to iron. Those were different fields, right, because they were making bigger parts, and iron has different properties. But yeah, the principles, though, were the same. He was basically starting metalworking and material science in America, right, is what he was doing. And that did carry forth. All right, I'm seeing the door is opening mysteriously, right, so I may have just a minute or two left. I'm happy to keep answering questions later, and I think I will be also signing books if anyone's interested, and I'd be delighted to talk. But I will answer your question whether you want to buy a book or not. Right, and all this. Maybe should I stop now? I'm saying, oh my God, if you could see the dessert table that I see right now, this is amazing right here. Okay, so I feel like I've run a little bit over time, so why don't I stop here, but I'd love to take further questions as you enjoy some dessert and we move forward. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.